welcome. I'm Becca Cantor, Jewish Book Council's editorial director, and I'm delighted to have you join us today for the very first meeting of Paper Brigade's Short Story Club. As you may know, Paper Brigade is Jewish Book Council's annual literary journal, and it celebrates the breadth and diversity of Jewish books today through a mix of articles, interviews, fiction, poetry, and artwork. At each meeting of our Short Story Club, we'll discuss a work of fiction published in the journal together with its author, and today we are so pleased to be joined by Yael van der Wouden, the author of Into the Mud. In addition to Yael, I'm joined by Paper Brigade's fiction editor, Josh Rolnick, and executive editor, Carol Kaufman. The three of us will kick off the first half of today's meeting with some questions for Yael, and for the second half, we'll invite you to jump in. If you'd like to ask a question, you can either raise your virtual hand or write your question in the chat. On the top right of your screen, you have the option of viewing the discussion in gallery or speaker mode, so please choose whichever one you prefer. And just a reminder to mute yourself if you aren't speaking at the moment. We're also posting a link to purchase the current issue of Paper Brigade with Yael's story in it, and just until midnight tonight, we're offering you $5 off with the code SHORTSTORY. It's now my pleasure to properly introduce Yael van der Wouden. Yael is a teacher and writer based in the Netherlands, and she's currently finishing her first novel, a post-war mystery romance. Yael, thank you so much for being here today.
No, thank you for having me.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm so excited to do this and a little bit intimidated by the number of people present, but it's okay.
Well, we're all so eager and so excited to have you here. And I wonder if you could just start off by telling us a bit about Into the Mud and what inspired you to write the story.
Yeah, of course. So it's a story about two girls who go into a really hot summer, a little bored and a little lost, and one of them starts playing around with some mystical powers and some mud, and she creates a golem. And it's really about sort of what happens after that, what happens with the interaction between the two of them, the power dynamic between the two of them, and the fact that they both sort of want to control either each other or this thing that they've created between them.
Yeah, that's so interesting and a wonderful summary of the story. So to go back to the real life influences from the story, I know that you moved from Israel to the Netherlands, where you are right now, when you were 10 years old. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how that experience factored into this world that you created in Into the Mud.
Yeah, of course. So I think the way that that move influenced this story is more that this story became something that didn't exist for me when I came here, because there was a very, very, very small Jewish community in the city that we moved to. And in general, the Netherlands doesn't have a very thriving and big Jewish community. I always joke with my sister, it's just like, it's us and two people. There's five of us. That's it. And so to write a story that sort of the way that I wrote this, the city that they're in, is physically and sort of visually, it looks like the city that we moved to in the Netherlands, but the heat is not is not Dutch at all, and the parks and everything are very, very Israeli to the way that I remember them. But also, it's very much the community. The community is there's a very there's a Jewish community that doesn't even need to be explained, right? Everybody is either Jewish or not Jewish, but there is a synagogue, there is a community, there is a rabbi, there is a dibuk in the microwave, right? There is a golem in the lake. Like these are things that are just part of the fabric of this town, and I wanted to sort of mesh all the things from my childhood together, but also create something that a Jewishness that really didn't need to be contextualized, or didn't need to be explain, okay, why are there more than 10 people, Jewish people in this town? And it's sort of my imaginary little world where what I think what I really wanted to have as a kid, to not be the outsider, not be the only one here. And so I created it in this world, and then I threw in some other trouble that I in other ways.
Yeah, exactly. And so fascinating to hear you say that because, in addition to the real world influences, you also have these magical elements and these Jewish mythological creatures that are just sort of part of the everyday life of this world. You spoke a little bit earlier about this idea of control, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more how the magical elements in this story kind of allowed you to emphasize um, the themes, the underlying themes of the story.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think what it was for me is that I've been for a while now, I've been a little bit obsessed with the idea of the mean girl, the idea of that girl who wasn't very nice to you in high school. And not just from a point of view of like, oh, I'm thinking back to this time in my life where I also had definitely mean girls in my life, and some of them were my friends and some of them were my enemies and some of them were my frenemies. But also, like, to what degree was there like these really intense friendships that were all about controlling each other? But also, I think it's so interesting to look back and think, like, was I ever that person? And like, I think we all have a little bit of a mean girl in us. And but I think it's at the end of the day, it's all about control. So I thought it would be so interesting to take something so, in my experience, so like so teenagery, but also very 90s in my, personal world, the fashion and the and just the yeah, everything about it. But and then really expand on the idea of control within these really obsessive friendships, within these intense friendships, and see what happens if that control was also expanded into something magical, into something like a golem, into something that is both grand and mystical, and then somehow is reduced to like the plaything of two teenage girls. So yeah, I thought it would be interesting to play with something that feels really small, is sort of a summer in a teenage girl's life, and then throw in something that is historical and grand and big in other ways.
That's fantastic. It's so interesting, and you definitely do such an amazing job of that in this story. Um, and I wonder because, as you're saying, the core of this story, it really is the relationship between Debbie and Miriam, these two girls. I wonder if you could read aloud a quick passage that sort of highlights their initial dynamic.
Of course, yes. Have a passage prepared. Um, just a sip of water just in case. Um, One time last year, Miriam held court during lunch and I was sitting nearby. I had picked a spot on the damp concrete before she and the gentry showed up, and I hunched over my food so that no one would see that it wasn't a sandwich. It wasn't that anyone was making fun of my food, only that I was embarrassed by it, and the others might smell that. Someone always seemed to smell it when you were ashamed of something. Then Miriam showed up, a cloud of sugar and bad breath popularity trailing her. Other popular girls, less popular girls, girls who just wanted to be around her. She spoke at length about how the gym teacher who sent her out of class probably hated her because he was probably in love with her. Pathetic, she called him. And then somehow everyone was talking about blowjobs. They kept on saying that word, blowjobs, blowjobs, and then cackled. The sound echoed against the walls of the schoolyard. I tried very hard not to look. I was trying too hard not to look, and they smelled it. One of the girls said, "Hey, Debbie. Hey, Debbie." I was putting away my lunch. It had rained the whole morning, and so everything was dark gray, the tile, the hard benches, the pebbles, the sky. They called my name some more, and I glanced up. Miriam said, "Do you know what a blowjob is, Debbie?" And then to the crowd, "I don't think she knows what a blowjob is." I mumbled, "I know what it is." And Miriam got up and stood on the bench and said, "What? What did you say? Oh my God, what did you say?" Her puffy jacket was sliding off her shoulders. She looked almost bare underneath it. The straps of her top were sliding down as well. It was so cold that day, but she didn't seem to feel it. She wasn't shivering at all.
Thank you so much, Yael. It's so interesting to hear you read that passage actually aloud and hear it in your voice. Um, I just think that this is so interesting, and I wonder if you could talk just a little bit more about what that passage really highlighted for you, and then a little bit about the girls' relationship as it evolves throughout the story.
Yeah, I think the reason why I wanted to pick this passage is that this is one of the first passages pretty early on in the story when you get like a flashback to establish, okay, what is their relationship when it's not summer and they're not allowed to be seen as friends by the rest of the world. And to really show, okay, Miriam's not nice to her, but she's still seeking her out. So even in the moment where they're not supposed to be friends, and even in the moments where there is so much tension and violence in a way, sort of, verbal violence between them, there's still a connection there, and there's still a desire constantly from um, Debbie to turn away and for Miriam to seek her out. And that sort of pull and push of Debbie turning away but still answering, and then Miriam sort of coming closer and coming closer, and trying to sort of to poke her to see what kind of reaction can I get out of this quiet little girl. This escalates throughout the story, and then when they're drawing closer to each other and their relationship develops into something else over the course of the summer, that remains until something breaks, right? Until Debbie is the one who has some kind of power over Miriam. And what happens then? Okay, what happens when Miriam is no longer in charge, or no longer in charge of the golem? And what happens then in such an intense relationship?
Thank you so much, Yael. And before I hand this over to Josh and Carol, and then to everyone else, and actually just a reminder, everyone, if you would want to put your questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand if you're already thinking of some. Yael, I have one more question for you. I'm sure that everyone was so intrigued by the description of the novel that you're working on now. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. It's a novel set in the 1960s in the Netherlands, so really the post-war years. And it's about a young woman who lives alone in her late mother's house, and is suddenly stranded there with her brother's new girlfriend. Her brother's new girlfriend has to stay with her for a while, and then she really doesn't like this girl, and as sort of things develop, things start disappearing from the house. And that is really all I can say at this moment, but it's about legacies of homes, and it's about the legacy of the war, and it's about the ways that we slowly unpack sort of the um histories that we didn't know that we carried with us.
Well, thank you, Yael, and I'm sure that all of us are now so eagerly waiting for your book to come out, and hopefully we'll be among your first readers of it.
Oh, I hope
Uh,
so.
Perfect. And I now like to invite Josh and Carol if you guys would like to jump in with a question, and anyone else would like to put their questions in the chat or raise their virtual hand.
Carol, do you want to start off?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Josh. Yeah, Al, I love your story, needless to say, or maybe not needless to say, but based on what you've been talking about today, I'm even more intrigued and curious about the ending of the story.
Mhm.
Like, who's up and who's down?
Yeah.
Who, and I found myself wondering what happens next. But of course, that's beyond the story scope. But I'd like to know what your thoughts are about creating that ending, where
Yeah,
it's
of
kind of
course.
ambiguous.
It is kind of ambiguous. So the ending, I hope this is not a spoiler, but if you're here, then it's what you signed up for. So I'm sorry in advance. You can mute me if you don't want to be spoiled. But the ending, what happens in the ending is so Debbie's the one to make the golem at the end, and she uses that golem in order to find Miriam, who ran away from home. And at that very last moment, what I wanted to play with is that idea of control again, right? Miriam does the thing that she's always done to the golem, right? You spit in somebody's mouth, you put the truth, the word of God in the ear, and then you have control over somebody. and she walks through some of those steps with Debbie in order to try and see if Debbie will go away, if she can still control Debbie and tell her to go away. And then Debbie, for the first time, fully sort of in charge of the decision that she makes, stays. So rather, where before control was very much about pushing other people away, now the lack of control is about them coming together in one way or another. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of like what I was playing with here. Like the moment that Debbie gains control, what she does, rather than turn away from Miriam, that's what it seems like for the first half of the story. Like Debbie actually wants to, half of her wants to run away from it. In the last part, she uses sort of her new sense of control to actually move toward Miriam. And I mean, I can tell you that what I imagine sort of beyond the story, when I first came up with the idea, it was like a far larger scope of a thing that in the end, there wasn't there wasn't space for it and there wasn't a lot of time for it. But I imagine that these two wouldn't have quite been able to fully find each other this one summer. But I like to imagine that 20 years from now or 10 years from now, their paths will cross again and they will have to sort of come to terms with the summer as adults and possibly still go through the same processes of, okay, who likes the other one better, who's in control, who always has to sort of beg for attention or not, and work out what they mean for each other, but then as clumsy adults.
Oh, I love your answer. Thank you.
So if I could jump in, thanks Carol, and thanks Becca. Yael, where you ended, I think as I'm a teacher of short story writing. First of all, I'm so excited that we're here to talk about a single short story for the entire duration of this program. It makes me very happy. And I love where you ended because I think the very best short stories chart a change in a character, but do it in an incredibly subtle way in a compressed space. And my own feeling is it's hard to know ahead of time where you're going to end. So actually, I'd like to ask a craft question, and there's a lot of questions in the chat, and we want to get to them in a moment. But just I'd like to go back to the beginning. One of my favorite quotes about writing is E.L. Doctorow's much quoted that writing a novel or a story is like driving across country at night with your headlights on, and that you can only see as far as the front of your headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way.
Mm-hmm.
And at least when I start, when I teach too, I talk about the importance of being a mad person, not knowing where you're going at the start, only seeing that very next sentence.
Mm-hmm.
Other writers write in different ways. Other writers outline and are very thorough. They think they have a very clear sense of where they're going ahead of time. I'm wondering how you wrote this story. How much of it did you know in advance? How much do you give over to your imagination and sort of that mad person mode of writing, if at all?
Yeah, no, I think so I also love that quote. But I'm afraid I'm a very different writer because I absolutely outline nearly everything. I outline it in the same way as if it's a movie that I need to sort of describe very quickly. So I have for every scene, I have a description of scenery, of like the mood that I want that scene to have, colors maybe, and then the dialogue very quickly, also in a script form. And then, so I'm quite strict in that sense. But then once I start writing, I do allow myself to veer off the script that I've created for myself. I'm not bound to it. It's really more of a guideline. So I would say I have a map, and I follow the map in order to sort of know where I'm going. But I'm not 100% in the dark at all times. But when I come up with it, it does sort of like seem to sort of flow out of nothing, to rise to the surface as if almost fully formed. And then my favorite thing is to start asking myself questions. For example, I usually start with a scene, and I think for this one, the scene that came to me first was the two girls at the lake making the golem. And then the question was like, okay, but why? And why did they get there? Okay, so they're not quite friends, they're only allowed to be friends now. Okay, what does that mean for the next step? Okay, what does that mean for the next step? What does that mean for their relationship? And then to see, can I find patterns, and can I find interesting dynamics that would make this an make the addition of the golem um really pertinent. Because if it doesn't do anything, then why am I writing it? I
Mhm.
hope that answered your question more or less.
Yeah, really, really appreciate it. Thank you. I think, Becca, can I hand it back to you to ask some of the questions in chat?
Sure,
Thanks,
absolutely.
Al.
I also found that really fascinating to outline it, even to the extent of like the colors that are coming to your mind, because that definitely translates into the story as well. So
Mm.
just
I think
really fascinating to hear.
I have to credit my parents for that. They've been in animation and film and the artists, and I think that really seeped through into my writing too.
So interesting. Well, I want to give a chance to ask these amazing questions that are coming in the chat. One person is writing, Arlene is asking, I was curious about the choice of names of the protagonists and the need for the reader to know what a golem is. So a question about the target audience slash Jewish content.
Hmm. So I think because like what I said in the beginning, the fact that I wrote this from a place where I'm just like, I just want to create a version of my world where I don't need to explain Jewishness to the environment. That's why I made everything as just normal as possible, as in like no one wonders at these things. And I think that was also what was so fun about it, because I think I've grown up reading quite a few kids getting to do magic, but then it's incredibly Christian in its legacy. You have your Harry Potters, you have your whatever's, and
Narnia.
your Narnias, and I really enjoyed the idea of getting to do that with a golem. Like, how often do you get to read a golem outside of like the classic, Yiddish folk tales? It came from that place, really, of me really trying to play with it and having some fun.
So interesting. Um, Abby Weaver, who wrote a short story that was published in our last issue of Paper Brigade, also has a comment in here that I thought is so lovely. Abby, I don't know if you would like to read out I can just read it, or we can just see it in the chat because I think it's just really lovely. Um, I will, and Abby, thank you so much for being here. I love this sort of cross issue authors being able to connect with one another. Um, Mark Cohen has a question. How many drafts did you go through before you had your final version?
Oh man. So there were a few drafts that I went through before I sent it into the Paper Brigade, and I think maybe like three modest drafts, and then after I heard back from you guys, I think I don't know how many times we went back and forth, but it was quite a few times. But it was such a fun process because it wasn't just about nitpicking about the war, but really we worked together, me and all the editors, with okay, how can we make the heart of the story really sort of what am I trying to say? Beat the loudest. Like how can we make the core as strong as we possibly can? And also a few scenes were added in the process of that, and a few scenes were deleted in the process of that. So it was I really got a lot of space to play within this world through the Paper Brigade, which was so much fun. I think number wise, was it like 23 at the end, Becca? I don't know.
I don't know either, but to second your comment, it was such a pleasure to work on this with you too, and just such a pleasure to sort of inhabit this world for a little bit of time. But I honestly don't know how many drafts it was. But that's a great question. And I also want to jump to Ada's question, who says, I'm curious about your language. It sounds like you wrote this story in English. Where did you get such a command of English while living first in Israel and then growing up in the Netherlands?
Yes. So, this is, I think I answered this question several times a week, and it's not a question that I'm bothered with. It's just, to me, it's like I rarely think about it, and then I was like, oh yeah, this is not a regular thing. So my parents communicate in sort of a combination of English, Hebrew, and Dutch. But I think for especially when I was young, English was a big part of it. So um, the English that my parents spoke to each other, because my mom is Israeli, so she speaks Hebrew, and my dad is Dutch, so he speaks Dutch. So the English that sort of bridged that gap was the English that I grew up with. And then into TV and radio really filled in the rest. Um, but yeah, it's funny because it really is my first language in a way, even though it isn't my parents' first language. And then when I started writing, so Dutch is really my third language. So when I started writing, at that point I'd been here for, I don't know, I mean, I've always been writing a little bit, but Hebrew had sunk enough that I wasn't confident enough in it, and Dutch didn't quite feel right. For many reasons. And so I've always just written in English, and so it's never been something that I've questioned. But I think definitely there's things that I do in English that are not allowed, and they're that they are direct or indirect translations from either Hebrew or Dutch. And then sometimes people comment on these things and say, "Oh, that's such a interesting turn of phrase." And then I see it, I was like, "Oh no, yes, no, it's an interesting, yeah, that's not a mistranslation of a completely odd proverb in Hebrew."
Well, yeah, I think that also it kind of allows you to play with language and maybe see some innovation that you wouldn't otherwise.
I super like that interpretation, other than my brain just like did a cross thing.
Well, I want to ask a question from Nancy who says, Miriam, the water on the shore, the reeds, also biblical. Is that intentional? And she also asks about the title of your novel, please.
Mm. Not intentional, but I I like it. I like that it feels biblical because it's um I think there might, okay, this is going out on a limb. I don't know how out there this theory is, but I think so many biblical stories that we have these days are Western interpretations of what Middle East sort of, ancient times might have felt like. And I think that might still be in my writing, because I'm writing from a Dutch perspective about sort of Israel, I'm trying to sort of take bits of Israel and put them in the Netherlands, which is, I mean, what an endeavor. But things like the reeds, that's very, very Dutch. But the lake, there's also, I think there's something uh quite, I mean, what am I trying to think? The Kinneret. I would sort of I have this very clear memory of being a child and going to the Kinneret as with a school trip, and sort of, yeah, that combination of things that look quite sort of European, but then through the heat lens of Israel. I don't know if that checks out, but that was that was just a thought that flit through.
Well, guys, we are actually almost out of time. I hate to say this because there are a million amazing questions, and I feel like, yeah, as always, I could just talk to you forever. I do want to ask one last question from Evie, which is, who is your favorite character in this story? And do you see yourself in either of the characters or both of them at all?
Oh, I adore Miriam. I it's she's quite terrible, but she's so insecure at the same time, and it's really hard not to sympathize with that. And also, there's a part of me that always wishes that I had the kind of confidence and the kind of I don't care attitude that girls like her used to have in high school. And I think that the part of me also wants to sort of forgive my high school bullies in a way, or maybe I'm writing my high school bullies as a process of gaining control over something. I'm sure that my therapist will have a lot to say about that, but yeah, there's definitely something about Miriam that fascinates me. But I think Debbie, who do I see myself? I mean, I was definitely Debbie as a kid, but I definitely have a little bit of Miriam in me as well. I think that's inevitable.
Well, Yael, thank you so much. Um,
Thank you. Thank everyone.
One sec, I'm just checking the chat. Um, In any case, this was fascinating. Thank you so, so much to everyone who joined us today. Our mission at Jewish Book Council is to educate and enrich the community through Jewish literature. We're a small nonprofit, and support from readers like you is crucial to our initiatives. I'd like to encourage you to support us by becoming a JBC member. And if you're intrigued by what you've heard today and would like to read more, we're posting the link to purchase Paper Brigade and the discount code again. The next meeting of Paper Brigade Short Story Club will be with Stephen Volinetz, the author of Shari Umuna, on March 2nd. You can find a link to register for that in the chat as well, and I hope to see you all there. Thank you so much again, and have a wonderful rest of the day.